Hello, my hardworking students. Here we are again. We're going to continue our discussion on cell injury, and we're going to focus on the causes of oxidative stress. And once we're done with that, we will be able to wrap up our topic of hypoxia and then move on to cell adaptations as all part of cell injury. After that, we have to discuss the different forms of cell death. So in the previous video, we focused especially on all the consequences of hypoxia. And here now, as I said, we're focusing on the causes of oxidative stress. And of course, hypoxia is at the top of our list. So we've already done that. But there are other things that can cause oxidative stress, such as something called reperfusion, malnutrition, either overeating or not eating enough, and all kinds of environmental agents. We're just going to look at some. And then with regards to phagocytosis, we will learn lots of things about phagocytizing cells that can cause oxidative stress. And then we'll briefly discuss how um, the use of supplemental oxygen could potentially also cause oxidative stress. So what is reperfusion? Well, you know by now that perfusion means just blood flow, right? So reperfusion implies that there must have been an interruption in the blood flow, and now we're allowing for it to start all over again, the blood flow. So reperfusion. Clearly, this can happen when a blood clot forms in a vessel. And if that blood clot is small enough, then that could be dealt with by the body. We have mechanisms, we'll learn about those, to where a clot can dissolve. But in the meantime, during the interruption, of course, the tissue cells are going to suffer from hypoxia. And, we spent a lot of time in our previous slides, or I should say video, discussing slides um, with the consequences of hypoxia. So we're going to see that at least ROS begin to form in addition to all these other consequences. But let's then say that perfusion restores itself. There's now so many ROS accumulated that the blood can't deal with it and remove them all, and we're starting to see tissue damage. And then that on top of all that leads to a calcium overload after perfusion has been restored. And so we're seeing, you know, multiple forms of injury on top of hypoxic injury, um, which we collectively refer to as reperfusion injury. Oxidative stress can also be caused by a poor diet, whether that is by means of overeating to where a person develops obesity. Obesity leads to lots of oxidative stress, which then leads to many, many diseases. And this picture shows some of those diseases that easily develop or consequences that result from oxidative stress due to obesity. But we can also look at the other extreme where a person is poorly nourished or starving, and then we're seeing all kinds of consequences as well. One of the things we will learn a lot about is anemias, and there's different forms of anemias. Most of us are used to iron deficiency anemia, but there are different kinds. For instance, when a person doesn't have the proper intake of vitamin B12, they might suffer from a different anemia. You don't take in enough vitamin C, you don't eat enough proteins with amino acids to build hemoglobin. You see where this is going. So deficits in nutrition lead to all kinds of consequences, and often this is due to oxidative stress. So far we've looked at hypoxia, we've looked at reperfusion, we've looked at malnutrition as causes of oxidative stress. You're going to study phagocytosis in quite a bit of depth when we get to the immune system, and then we'll briefly discuss the problems that might occur due to supplementing a patient with oxygen. So that means that next we're going to spend quite a bit of time on some environmental agents and their um, why they cause oxidative stress. Now, of course, there's many environmental things, agents that can create all kinds of issues in our body via oxidative stress. So we're not going to visit all of them. We'll just handpick a few. So when we use the term environment, let's not forget that that might mean the internal environment of cells. And we all know that cells internally can be responsible for the making of ROS. So those are going to be referred to as endogenous sources of ROS. But of course, the external environment can also produce ROS, and so those we call exogenous sources. And lots of examples are listed here. We're going to focus on air pollutants and radiation primarily. So air pollution is, of course, part of chemical agents, along with drugs and heavy metals and all kinds of things. And they can be quite destructive via oxidative stress, or you can also call that respiratory burst. You know, they can damage cell membranes and organelles, start messing around with enzyme pathways. We've mentioned poisons before, such as cyanide. They can start coagulate proteins of the cell so they're unusable, mess around with concentration gradients, pH, things that should start to sound familiar as um, mechanisms, no, not mechanisms, but as causes that are going to really lead to major cell injury and possibly cell death. As we all know, air pollutants are very damaging to our respiratory system. You know, you've heard of uh, ozone, how damaging it can be, but let's not forget things such as carbon monoxide, lead, uh, there's nitrogen dioxide, and all these things that we find in the air that we can refer to as particulate matter. Um, but many of the air pollutants, such as ozone, let's say, result from the burning of fossil fuels. And so they're not easy to eliminate because, of course, we need to drive our cars and the industry needs to be able to do what they need to do. All right, so let's first set the record straight. Ozone is not a bad thing as long as it stays up high where it normally is. So as long as it stays up high above the Earth, it's actually protecting us from the UV radiation from the sun. But what happens is that ozone can form in the air when it reacts with that nitrogen dioxide molecule that is um, present in all of these burning fossil fuels. And so now we have ozone surrounding us, and when we breathe it in, it's not a good thing. So remember, as long as ozone is up high, it's safe. It's not so good when we can breathe it in. So the second environmental agent we'll take a closer look at is radiation. But really, what is radiation? Well, when energy is emitted or transmitted, it forms waves and particles, and that's what we refer to as radiation. Now, we can divide radiation up into non-ionizing radiation versus ionizing radiation, and we will define clearly exactly what that means. But basically, when we get into the ionizing radiation zone, things are starting to become more threatening, despite the fact that we do take advantage of some of the benefits of ionizing radiation, as you know, because of some of the medical imaging that we do. So let's try to understand the different forms of radiation a little bit better. And so this time we're going to focus on the diagram here. So notice that this axis, if you want to call it that, or this part of this scale is representing the frequency expressed in hertz. I'm sure you've heard of that unit of the radiation, while over here we're looking at the wavelengths, for which we use the metric system. So when we look at frequency, we go from very high frequency, 10 to the 19th, to a much lower frequency, right? So from low to high frequency. While here, where we're looking at wavelengths, we go from a long wavelength, 1,000 meters, which is a kilometer, all the way to a tenth of a nanometer, and even smaller when we use another unit called angstrom. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. Not really very important for you guys to know, but I do need for you to recognize that on this side, maybe I should mark it, as we go up, frequency goes up this way, right? In this direction, while over here, the length of the wavelength goes up, length up this way, frequency up that way. I hope that makes sense. So what you see is that the 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 type of radiation that is actually the least or not really harmful, the non-ionizing radiation, has low frequency and long wavelengths. So low frequency goes from low to high. So we're going to be in this range with high, low frequency, long length. So think these almost sound the same, low and long, right? Or they both start with LO. They belong to non-ionizing radiation, and clearly ionizing radiation is going to be at the opposite end over here then. So as I've been saying, non-ionizing radiation is typically not harmful. It includes all of these different waves listed below, and you saw those listed on the diagram as well. Although you know very well that when we are exposed long enough to the sun or a tanning booth, we can get burned. So, there's this fine line to where non-ionizing UV waves can become possibly harmful. But really, what does that mean, non-ionizing radiation? It's called non-ionizing because the the energy is not going to be such that the particles can vibrate strong enough to lose electrons. Okay, so the radiation energy is just not making these particles, whether they're molecules or atoms or ions, vibrate enough to where suddenly these electrons escape. The moment electrons can escape, we're now shifting into ionizing radiation. So ionizing radiation is typically harmless, except, as we discussed a moment ago, that too much of a good thing, such as being out in the sun, can start creating damage to cells. But we need to have some exposure to the sun's UV rays so that we can begin the process of vitamin D synthesis. So as we'll learn in more depth later on, it is with the help of the sun's UV rays that cholesterol molecules in the cell membranes of our keratinocytes in our skin can begin to start creating the precursor to a molecule of vitamin D. It still needs to go through several steps, including other organs, but this is why it's so important for us to be out in the sun for a certain amount of time every day. Non-ionizing radiation can typically not penetrate body surfaces again because these particles are just not vibrating all that much. It's a different story with ionizing radiation because now the energy from the radiation is strong enough to create an intense vibration in the particles to where they do lose their electrons. So that's what we call ionization, the losing of these electrons. And this is now going to create new particles that like to go and steal electrons from other particles, and we start to create this cascade effect, because if one chemical steals an electron from another one, that other one becomes a free radical, etc., etc. And so again, when you go back to the images we looked at earlier, um, a lot of the imaging that we do to look inside of our body, such as X-rays and gamma rays, um, are are to some extent beneficial to us, but we have to be very careful with them because they can damage our tissues. And then we mentioned earlier that UV rays can actually make it into the ionizing radiation um, level. So because this ionizing radiation can indeed penetrate to deep within the body, um, it allows us to do medical imaging. It allows us to use a form of radiation to treat cancer patients. But as we know, too much of this can lead to changes in the DNA. So the radiation can function as a mutagen and therefore create cancer. So there's this balance between it being a cancer treatment and it creating cancer. It particularly can easily damage the DNA of rapidly dividing cells. Epithelial cells can divide very easily, as you know by now, but also red bone marrow cells, because that's where white blood cells and red blood cells and platelets are formed. So let's come back to our list of the things that can cause oxidative stress. And so indeed, we've done hypoxia, we've perfusion, malnutrition, we've looked at air pollution and radiation. I already mentioned that we'll discuss phagocytosis in our discussion on the immune system, that you will primarily study on your own, but then we'll also look at disorders of the immune system. And so that finally leaves us with the consequences of excess supplemental oxygen. You've heard of people using oxygen therapy, and that needs to be moderated very carefully, because all this extra oxygen can indeed create extra ROS molecules that our body cannot control. And so while this can be very, what's the right word? While extra oxygen, for instance, in the hyperbaric chamber can be healing for some wounds, like I said, it needs to be watched carefully so that the patient is not exposed for too long and too high of a concentration of oxygen. And so here we have reached the end of our first subtopic of cell injury, which is hypoxia. And just to refresh our memory, remember that hypoxia has some major consequences. We looked at how hypoxia causes a decrease of or lack of ATP, and ATP is very important in cell signaling. So without ATP, we don't have good enough cell signaling. Our ion pumps can't function, which ultimately can lead to calcium overload and kill cells. We might see an accumulation of acidity, or lactic acid, I should say, and as we all know, then all the proteins and enzymes of cells can't function as well. Not only that, we might see that lysosomes start to fall apart and release their contents, which then literally leads to autophagy. Hypoxia also leads to um, the activation of the so-called heat shock proteins, which is almost a good thing, right? Because they're going to help fix some of the proteins that were damaged by refolding them or folding them at least accurately if they can. And then finally, the biggest problem as a result of hypoxia, oh, I shouldn't say the biggest problem, but another big problem is um, the accumulation of more and more ROS, reactive oxidant species, to the point that our antioxidants in our body cannot control them anymore. And the accumulation of ROS leads to oxidative stress or respiratory burst. And then we also learned that there are other things aside from hypoxia that can cause the accumulation of ROS. And so that's what we focused on in this particular video. So we're now ready to take a look at the second subtopic of cell injury, which is cell adaptations.